Hi, my name is Matt Fiello. I'm a technical marketing engineer with the Cisco UCS BU, and I want to take some time to talk to you about UCS Central, specifically infrastructure firmware upgrades using UCS Central. Let's note some considerations prior to upgrading. First of all, you're going to want to study the release notes of the new firmware release. You're certainly going to want to understand completely what new features, if any, have been introduced in that firmware, what caveats, bugs got resolved and fixed with that firmware, and certainly any caveats that remain to be fixed. You want complete knowledge of that. Also, you're going to want to study the firmware upgrade guides. Make sure procedurally you understand what to do. Be aware of all elements in the hardware-software support matrix. Make sure your operating systems are supported. Make sure your blade, specific blade firmware is supported when you upgrade the infrastructure. So, could be possibly caveats there. You need to be smart about that and study the hardware-software support matrix. You also want to make sure you have a pretty healthy system. From a UCS manager perspective, a UCS domain perspective, make sure that you address any faults that would potentially affect the upgrade. Certainly don't want any hanging user maintenance acts out there during the upgrade, etc. Just to note that UCS Central leverages the firmware auto install ability of UCS Manager. So UCS Central is just reaching down, delivering the infrastructure firmware to the UCS domain and leveraging firmware auto install within the domain. And based upon a schedule or immediate action, UCS Central orders the manager to download the firmware, okay, using curl copy. So it's not a push from UCS Central. It's rather UCS Central reaching down to the finite state machine on the UCS manager, and then UCS manager reaches back and pulls the firmware using curl copy down to the domain. You want to make sure that you have some minimum network requirements, especially if this UCS domain is remote across a wide area link. Make sure you have less than 500 milliseconds of latency to that remote UCS domain, and also make sure you have at least 1.5 megabits per second of bandwidth to that domain. These are pretty standard fare requirements that are in the install guide of UCS Central. And as always, if possible, please test firmware upgrades in a lab before actually introducing new firmware to the production environment. Okay, so let's move on to a demo. I'm actually going to demonstrate a firmware upgrade on a hardware UCS domain using UCS Central. So we'll walk through all the different facets of that. I will be performing different pauses throughout the demo to accelerate the demo, so we're not sitting there watching things transpire, taking minutes and minutes for something to download, or minutes and minutes for something to upgrade. So I'll try to accelerate certain areas to make the video a little easier to view. So let's move on to the demo. Okay, so now on to the demonstration. This is one of my lab UCS Central systems. I have a physical UCS domain registered to this UCS Central. And this is version 1.4.1a of UCS Central, so this is the latest release. And if I go and look at my domains, you can see I have a couple hardware domains. This UCS1 domain that's actually in the root/Americas/SJC domain group, ending in .10. This is the domain that we're actually going to upgrade. The faults here really are major faults, are of no concern. We have some cables missing on one of the fabrics, so that's not really an issue. It's not going to hurt the upgrade. So let's look at a few things here. Let's go to the tools icon and go to firmware. What's nice about UCS Central is we've got these storyboards here that will actually walk you through the firmware upgrade process and give you different scenarios. So, not that you have to use these exact scenarios, but give you some ideas. Maybe how you want to architect the firmware upgrades in your environment. And talking about firmware upgrades, we're just doing the infrastructure firmware upgrade. So infrastructure is your A package firmware. It's your system and your kickstart for the Fabric interconnects. It's your new version of UCS Manager for the Fabric interconnect, and it's also your firmware for the chassis IOM modules in your chassis. The blade / server firmware, we're not going to do that. That is actually done with a host firmware package, a host firmware policy that's part of your service profile. So with UCS Central, there is no direct endpoint upgrades at this point. To upgrade the blade firmware, to upgrade your managed C-Series firmware, you need to do that with a host firmware policy. That's part of the service profile. Okay, so let's look at a few things here. First of all, you can provide your credentials, your CCO account for support.cisco.com, and you can simply sync the firmware versions down to UCS Central. That's basically the metadata, the header information for the firmware packages. And of course, you can set these up to automatically sync on a schedule that's conducive to what you wish. You can also do a manual sync. I've already done this. And what's that look like? Well, if you go here to firmware images, you can see all the different headers here. Now there's a lot of firmware here, as you can see from the quantity here. But I'm going to do some sorting here, sort of filtering. I'm actually going to filter on infrastructure because that's the only thing I'm interested in. And I'm going to subsequently do some additional filtering here. And I'm actually going to grab the 2.2 6G A package for infrastructure. And I simply just need to click on this. And if I come up here to the button, I can import selected image. So you can tell it's available for import. It's out on Cisco.com, but we want to download it to UCS Central. So I will go ahead and start that. Okay, so I can see here that I am in fact downloading, and I'm going to go ahead and pause the video at this point because it'll take probably about 10 minutes or so to download. Okay, so we've now completed the downloading of the firmware from Cisco.com. It's actually been imported. So the way I can see that is if I go back to my packages and I've selected infrastructure, but now I can use the filter here for imported, and I can see it goes right to the package I just downloaded. So now it says imported from Cisco.com. All right, so we're ready to use this. What I want to do next is actually bring up the actual UCS domain. The domain that I've chosen is actually part of the San Jose, the SJC domain group. And if I go to inventory, I can see I have one domain there, and it is the UCS1, ending in .10. So this is the domain that I'm going to be upgrading. Okay, so I like to go to the UCS domain and UCS Manager. Just want to show you a few things. I like to go in the navigation pane to the equipment tab and then all the way to the top of the hierarchy for equipment, and then the right side, installed firmware. This is kind of the state of the union of your firmware in that particular domain. So of course you want to verify the running version, startup version, any backup versions. Make sure that your status is good for update and activate. They should show a ready status. Of course, the firmware is deployed or pulled down by the UCS domain from UCS Central in an update process, which actually populates the backup area of memory, and subsequently then the activation phase moves the firmware from the backup to the startup area of memory, and then allows also a reboot, okay, which moves to the running version. Of course, the firmware that was the -1 then subsequently gets transferred to the backup area of memory. So that's how that process works. Okay, so let's move back to UCS Central, and I'm in my San Jose SJC domain group. I'm going to drive the show from there. Let's go to the firmware tab. And in my situation here, I'm going to actually schedule an infrastructure firmware update. I'm going to select the proper domain group, which is SJC. This is a 6200 series fabric interconnect. So I'm actually going to scroll down and pick the correct firmware version, 226 Golf, the A package. The catalog version will be included. I'm going to do a scheduled trigger, okay, instead of doing it immediately. I'm actually going to fabricate a schedule for 5-10 minutes into the future. Also, I'm going to disable user acknowledgement. Okay, so I'm going to treat this process as an auto kickoff of the firmware upgrade. Just to clarify how the user acknowledgements work, you have two user acknowledgements with the firmware auto install engine on UCS Manager. You acknowledge the subordinate fabric interconnect being upgraded first, right? And then halfway through the process, once the subordinate is upgraded and rebooted and comes up on the new firmware, and then you have a second user acknowledgement. The reason for the second user acknowledgement halfway is for you to verify the health of your HA. So when that subordinate comes back up on the new firmware, it has to reestablish HA with the primary, because the HA needs to be healthy, because then you're going to go and actually upgrade the primary. And the first thing that happens with the upgrading of the primary is you get a failover event. So the subordinate then becomes the primary, the new primary. So the HA has to be healthy. And that's why there's that mandatory pause in between that you have to acknowledge. So the first one can be disabled, and we can kick the firmware upgrade off on a schedule, but then you still have to acknowledge manually the one that's halfway. And we're looking possibly in the future of maybe giving you the option of automating that as well. Okay, so perhaps some future change with that. Also, a potential future change is taking the firmware, infrastructure firmware upgrades, kind of decoupling it from the domain group. The idea behind that is usually a domain group has multiple UCS domains, and I haven't run across very many customers that were interested in having more than one pair of FIs being upgraded at a time. And it's a little bit unnerving to have user acts on multiple domains. Now, having said that, there's ways around that. You can always go to the particular UCS domain. You can always go to the admin tab. You can go to UCS Central, where the registration pane is, and you can simply opt out of infrastructure and catalog firmware. So in other words, if you had 6 UCS domains in a domain group and you wanted to use UCS Central to upgrade just one of those domains, I would opt out of the policy on 5 of those domains. So basically UCS Manager, the domains, are not listening to any orders about upgrading the firmware. So that's an easy way around that. But in this case, we have a single domain and we're opted in. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually schedule our upgrade. Today's the 31st. And let's go ahead and schedule it for 6:45. Going to disable the first user rack. This applies to the first user rack. Okay, so we want it to kick off automatically. One domain, 226 golf is what we're upgrading to. Let's go ahead and schedule that. And while we're waiting for that to occur, let's go ahead and check out a few things. If we go over to the actual UCS Manager, we can see that on the Equipment tab for Firmware Auto Install, we do have a scheduled status. Notice the startup version is the new version 226 Golf. A couple other things I'd like to point out. Of course, prior to your upgrade, you want to make sure that you're aware of the space, the disk space on your fabric interconnects, the boot flash, and etc. You want to make sure that you're under 2/3 of capacity, under 2/3 used. Okay. If you have a bunch of old firmwares there that have been packages downloaded to the fabric interconnect, you want to make sure you clean up anything old. Really, you only need kind of the 0 gen, the current rev that you're on, and the -1. If you have older packages, with the exception of rare cases where you have blades running multiple firmwares for different reasons, you want to make sure you delete those. And let's go ahead and look at the subordinate as well. It should be exactly the same. And it is. And something else that we should check is before you do any firmware operations with infrastructure upgrades, you want to make sure that your HA status is completely healthy. So ours is yes up primary full. This should be yes up subordinate full. And it is. Okay, so at this point we're just kind of waiting for the firmware to start. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I'll come back once you start seeing some things here on the screen. Once things are up here and I can share. Okay, so we've hit our time for the beginning of the upgrade. And from UCS Central, one thing you can do is this little tools icon here is the configuration status. So with the latest release of UCS Central 141A, we brought this new information window to UCS Central. It's basically your finite state machine FISM status of the steps that are taking place down on the fabric interconnect. So you would see steps in order completing here within the configuration status window. Also, you can use the same status window when you associate a global service profile down to a blade and get all those good messages of basically success as it basically sends the service profile down and programs the blade. One thing here is kind of different is it's kind of reverse order, so you have to come over here to the bar and scroll down. I think I'm going to talk to the development about perhaps changing the order here. But we can see that we've started to do some things here. And we'll put this down for a while. And let's go over to UCS Manager. On the Equipment tab for Firmware Auto Install, we can see that we're in progress now. We go to the FSM tab, we can see some things here. Notice we have a step here to activate UCSM. So, I mean, at that point, we'll be upgrading our UCS Manager. You can see that we're on 226 Charlie currently. So we expect that to change. Okay, I have to be honest with you, this is kind of a boring process. This is about as exciting as watching grass grow or paint dry, but really that's the way we want it. We don't want to have exciting firmware upgrades, so it's good to be bored. It means things are working smoothly. Okay, so it looks like we are losing our UCS Manager because of the activation of UCS Manager. So we'll go ahead and exit out of that. Okay, just something I like to do is I like to go ahead and just do a little bit of cache cleanup. Get rid of perhaps any old JNLPs. Okay, and we can simply refresh the browser page here. Okay, and you can see that we now have 2.26 Gulf here. So go ahead and download the Java here, the GNLP. Just going to bring up a few windows that I like to have up. Looks like we're downloading the images as we speak. So this will take a little bit of time. You can see that our infrastructure firmware now appears in our firmware and backup tab for the domain group. You can actually click here and see that UCS domain UCS1 is in progress. Okay, so we are in a download images phase. And while this is downloading from UCS Central to the UCS domain, there's not a whole lot to see. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and I'll come back. Okay, so we can see that we've had a lot of progress here. We've downloaded the images. We're also copying the images from the primary to the subordinate FI. Deploying the firmware down to the IOMs in the chassis. That's called the update process. So if we come over on the general tab, we should see the IOMs being upgraded. I don't really like this term. It's an update process, but the opera state shows upgrading. You can see it here as well. You can see it here in UCS Central. Okay, so this will take a few minutes to complete the updating of the IOMs. What happens with that? Well, an update process basically deploys the firmware to the backup area of memory. Okay, that's what the update process does. The activate moves the firmware from the backup to the startup, and then offers the ability to reboot the endpoint, thus making the startup the running version. When you do the activate and do the reboot, then the predecessor firmware then moves to the backup. So at the end of this exercise, we would expect to see 226 Charlie actually be in the backup. So I'll pause the video and I'll be back. Okay, so we can see that we're completing our IOM update. We go to the General tab here. The update pushing of the firmware down to the IOMs has completed. It's already taken the step to activate the IOMs, but we set the flag for pending next boot. There's no real reason to activate the IOMs. Take 5 to 10 minutes to do that for them to reboot on the new firmware, when pretty much the next step is we have to upgrade the actual fabric interconnects themselves, which is going to be disruptive to the entire fabric one at a time. So the logic here is we link the IOM reboot for the respective fabric to the FI rebooting. So when the subordinate FI reboots to upgrade the firmware, then it's going to take also the IOM2s of every chassis connected, reboot those as well. So that's the logic. It looks like our subordinate FI is upgrading, so we can actually click on the subordinate here. You'll notice during a firmware upgrade, your scroll bar on the right side will get smaller. That's because there's actually another information pane that gets populated, the update status here. That's not normally there when you view your Fabric Interconnect General tab. Okay, so we can see that we've updated our steps here within UCS Central as well. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video again because there's not a whole lot to see until the subordinate fabric interconnect updates and then reboots. So I'll be back. Okay, so we have a little bit more activity here. It's progressing. Okay, getting alarms, which are normal. Critical faults, the node went down. This is all normal stuff. So while we're waiting, another thing we can do is we can actually CLI, secure shell into the VIP. And if we do a connect to local management, do a show cluster extended state, see their HA is not ready, peers down. Okay, it looks like it's coming back up. We have to be patient though, because it takes a little while for the HA to sync back up. We certainly do not want to continue on with the upgrade of the primary until HA is healthy. So that's why that that manual ACK is going to appear here shortly, halfway. And currently, there's no way to schedule that. You have to actually hit the button to upgrade the primary to continue on the workflow. We're entertaining the thought to perhaps have some logic in there and actually give you the option of scheduling that as well. So we'll see. If that's the case, then you could really have an unintended upgrade of your infrastructure firmware, like during the night. Okay, so we can see that our cluster HA is healthy. Yes up, subordinate full. Let's go ahead and switch over to the primary. Yes up, primary full. HA ready. You can see a pending activity popped in here. This is not a service profile or blade related pending activity, but a fabric interconnect for an FI reboot. Okay, so we have our pending activities. Everything looks good on the UCS domain. Let's switch over to UCS Central. We can see that we have pending user ACK here. And we're waiting for user ACK. Order 17 here. So we're healthy. Let's go ahead and look at our pending activities here. We have a pending activity to reboot or proceed with the upgrading of the primary FI. So let's go ahead and acknowledge that. See our pending act disappeared. We should lose our UCS manager here shortly, because when you upgrade the primary, you're actually going to initiate a failover. So the virtual IP will need to switch from the A fabric interconnect to the B fabric interconnect. So the upgraded subordinate will become the new primary. And before this thing dies, we can see that we are in fact upgraded on the subordinate to 226 Gulf, and our primary is starting to activate. So we'll lose this this manager here shortly. You can also click over on our A fabric interconnect, and because this is going through the upgrade process activation, we can scroll down and see the update status within the general tab of the FI. Okay, so we're at the point where the primary is rebooting for the upgrade, and we did in fact lose our UCS manager because of the VIP IP swapping over to the subordinate for the failover. So we'll go ahead and exit out of here. What I like to do is I like to go ahead and just kind of set up a continuous ping to the VIP. This will let me know when the swap over occurs. Okay, so it looks like the virtual IP has swapped over to the new primary, which was the subordinate that we upgraded first. Let's go ahead and refresh our browser page. Okay, we can see that our failover occurred. We have the FIB now as the primary. That all looks good. That looks good. Looks like HA is still not established yet. Let's go over to UCS Central. Okay, so it took a little bit for the config status to catch up. Okay, it looks like our HA status is healthy again. So yes up subordinate full on the A fabric FI. Yes up primary full on the subordinate. We can see that we have our infrastructure on 2.26G with a ready status for the FIs. And the IOMs, so that all looks good. Just a comment about the blades again. With UCS Central firmware upgrades, we only do the infrastructure. With the firmware auto install of the UCS Manager, there is no direct endpoint upgrades. So in other words, you can't push a firmware upgrade to a blade or a server that does not have a service profile. So you'll leverage the tried and true host firmware policy within UCS Central, a global host firmware policy. So you can download the B package or the C package, build your host firmware policy, then go to your service profile template, your global service profile template, update the policy. Of course, that would cause, if it's an updating template, that's going to cause user acts on your blades or your servers. Okay, and then you can sequentially manage the upgrade of those endpoints based on if it's hypervisor, leveraging maintenance mode and guest evacuations from a particular blade at a time, or if it's bare metal, you'll have to schedule an outage window where you can drop that server and then do the reassociation of the service profile to pick up the new firmware. Okay, so go ahead and make sure you check out your installed firmware tab here. Make sure that everything is correct as far as running version, startup version, backup version. As you can see with our IOMs here, our 2.26 Charlie has been moved to the backup. For packages here, here's the 2.2.6 Golf that was downloaded from UCS Central. This will eventually, shortly here, be automatically deleted. There's really no reason for this to stay here. This firmware has already been basically unzipped. Okay, if you would, its bits and pieces are already in the different areas of memory. With rare exception to some contingency, you don't really need this here. And if for some reason you have to get it here, we can certainly upload the firmware again, download it to the FIs. So if you notice that this disappears, that's by design. Everything's working correctly. That's part of a UCS Central infrastructure firmware upgrade. That's part of the process. But it'll take a few minutes for this to go away. Okay, so just to close out, over on the UCS Central side, everything looks good. Firmware ready. Look at the configuration status. All the steps are complete. Success. If we actually go to the domain group, SJC, firmware ready, green, we're good. If we go down to inventory, select the domain, you can see that UCS1 has in fact been upgraded. Okay, so that concludes our exercise and demonstration of how you use UCS Central to perform an infrastructure upgrade of a UCS domain. I hope you got some value out of this. Again, a couple things to consider is you want to absolutely adhere to the best practices and the minimum network requirements, i.e. less than 500 milliseconds of latency between UCS Central and a UCS domain that's in a remote location. You'll want to have at least 1.5 megabytes per second of bandwidth. Do all your due diligence and checks up front to make sure that you're upgrading to a good version of firmware that's supported. So that concludes our exercise, and happy upgrading, and good luck. Talk to you next time.